The Cold War in the Americas from 1945 to 1981. America's attitude towards communism always came in the form of resentment. Around May 7, 1945, Germany surrenders unconditionally to the United States, and relations between the United States and the Soviet Union fall apart due to conflicting interests, with the Soviet Union supporting communism and the United States supporting capitalism. Each side takes over Germany, with the US, France, and Britain controlling the western half, and the Soviet Union controlling the east. The United States, as well as the Soviet Union, began building a nuclear arsenal. The stockpiling of nuclear weapons and the atomic explosions which devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki created military and political tension between the United States and the USSR. This tension started several wars and led to a potential nuclear holocaust. Due to the differences encountered between the United States and the Soviet Union, people from East Berlin immigrated in mass numbers. Hundreds of thousands of people left East Berlin and were stopped at the border. On the night of August 12, 1961, without warning, soldiers and construction workers rapidly started the construction of the Berlin Wall, causing further tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union.
So the stem of the post-Second World War breakdown was in the Grand Alliance and the envy between countries. During the war, mainly Russia and the US had conflicting interests in the Grand Alliance. In addition, Stalin envied the US as he was kept out of the project of the making of the atomic bomb, so he sent spies to steal some information in the US. The US also interpreted the creation of Soviet buffer states as aggression, even though they were intended to be a sort of national defense. In addition, the US was envied by other countries as it was left virtually untouched, besides Pearl Harbor, whereas other European countries were in shambles, and Russia lost a significant portion of its population, about 30 million people, to the fighting in the Second World War. Stalin's choice to enter the war front in Japan after the US secured victory with the dropping of the atomic bombs is ambiguous, and it could be interpreted as either an act of greed or one of support for the US. Based on these points, I would argue that the post-Second World War breakdown of relations was in fact inevitable. Because the balance of world power was drastically shifted in the US's favor after the Second World War, the USSR and the US's aims in the reconstruction of Europe were disconnected, leading to a post-Second World War breakdown. Competing ideologies of communism and capitalism were bound to be misinterpreted, and notions such as the creation of Soviet buffer states or the secretive and exclusive creation of the atomic bomb altogether brewed jealousy and aggression between countries, specifically the US and the USSR. Chapter 2 is the key debate: why did the Cold War begin? There are three main viewpoints as to why the Cold War began: the orthodox viewpoint, the revisionist viewpoint, and the post-revisionist viewpoint. People upholding the orthodox viewpoint, like Arl Schlesinger, believe that Stalin's aggression started the war. People upholding the revisionist viewpoint, like William Appleman Williams, believe that America's desire to spread capitalism and free trade to benefit its economy started the Cold War. People upholding the post-revisionist viewpoint, like Martin Macaulay, believe that both the USSR and the US are at fault, and the Cold War started because of the clash between conflicting interests of capitalist economy and communist economy.
In this section, we look at some of the events leading up to the Truman Doctrine. During the Second World War, Stalin put pressure on Turkey in hopes of acquiring a narrow strait for direct access to the Mediterranean. This caused Truman to go before Congress and obtain a total of $400 million to help Turkey and other countries combat any communist influence. In order for such an action to be justifiable, Truman made a speech to Congress, later known as the Truman Doctrine, which depicted a divided world between free people and unfree people. This document effectively established the Cold War and led to a series of foreign policies which defined America's stance. The first of which is the Marshall Plan, in which $13 billion was given to West European nations in order to revitalize them as allies and trading partners. In 1949, NATO was formed as a response to Stalin's blockade of Berlin. Critics of the Truman Doctrine call it an ideological crusade without limits and state that Truman feared war with the Soviet Union. However, The Truman Doctrine, regardless of its intentions, revolutionized American foreign policy.
The fifth section question is, how did the Truman Doctrine impact Latin America? Here are 4 different instances where the Truman Doctrine impacted Latin America. The first instance where the Truman Doctrine impacted Latin America is the 1947 Rio de Janeiro Conference. Scheduled only a few months after the Truman Doctrine speech, the Rio de Janeiro Conference resulted in the signing of the Rio Treaty, which stated that American nations would constitute an attack on all and merit resistance if 2/3 of them agreed on action. Mexican journalist Narciso Basils Garcia described that Latin American nations were made compulsory automatic allies of the United States and that they received nothing in return following Truman's policy of containment. The second instance where the Truman Doctrine impacted Latin America was through the Point for Technological Assistive Program, which was a program started in 1949 which aimed to promote the creation of technological, scientific, managerial, and economic self-help programs in less developed countries. Latin America was grouped with Asia and Africa in the program and only received $79 million from the program, while the rest of the world received $18 billion in total. This bred resentment in Latin America, as this amount was far insignificant compared to the Marshall Aid Program, and created anti-Americanism ideology in Latin America. The third instance where the Truman Doctrine impacted Latin America was through the OAS, or the Organization of American States. The establishment of this program represented hemispheric unity, and the OAS held Pan-American conferences which were primarily led by the U.S., signifying the domination the U.S. had over Latin American nations. Through this organization, Latin American riots which were caused by economic problems were viewed as communist subversions, as the U.S. tended to view uprisings through a Cold War lens. The fourth instance where the Truman Doctrine impacted Latin America was through the ECLA, or the Economic Commission of Latin America. The ECLA was established in 1948 and criticized the U.S.'s economic policy, stating that the reason Latin American poverty was so bad was because they were the suppliers of raw materials instead of the manufacturers in an industrial nation. Overall, compared to Europe, Latin America was impacted by the Truman Doctrine to a significantly less extent. This is evident through the U.S. and Latin America's different focuses, which inhibited the impact of the Truman Doctrine had on Latin America. The U.S. was more focused on prohibiting the spread of communism and the domino theory, while Latin America was more concerned about economic aid and technological advancements. This is evident in the Rio de Janeiro Conference, where Truman sought collective security, and the Rio Treaty, which was supported by 2/3 of the countries and enforced collective security, became the primary outcome of the conference. Countries such as Brazil, Chile, and Cuba were also influenced by the U.S. to ban communist organizations and cut diplomacy with Soviet Russia. Again, the Truman Doctrine did not impact Latin America to a large extent, as the U.S. seemed to prioritize the reconstruction in Europe over the construction in Latin America. This is shown through the fact that 20 Latin American countries received $79 million compared to the $18 billion of aid received by European countries.
I will now be discussing Section 6 of the chapter on the subject of the Cold War and American society and culture. The section begins with a background on the Red Scare, specifically that American people disliked communism for its anti-American nature, being atheistic and taking away from the American dream. The Red Scare was primarily feared by right-wing individuals starting around 1930 due to the possibility of a socialist or communist takeover. During this era, the House of Un-American Activities began investigating possible communists in high positions, to a small degree at first, but to a much larger degree after World War II. Roosevelt tried getting the FBI director J. Edgar Hoover to track down and deal with possible communists. Once the Second World War was over, people in America felt even more strongly against the ideas of communism, especially when noting Soviet strength. The House of Un-American Activities gained support by Congressman John Rankin in 1945 with the request for its permanence and increase in ability. In 1947, this occurred as SWAC began investigating the Hollywood 10 as well as other artists, even putting some in jail. A 1950 act, known as the Internal Security Act, allowed further tracking of communist groups. When Truman got into power, he attempted to veto it, but failed, and then created Executive Order 9835, which investigated federal employees. J. Edgar Hoover pushed the FBI hunting of communists, which led to 1,000 total firings, and basically pushed Truman to continue recognizing the communist scare. Truman's Truman Doctrine, as well as Soviet success in creating atomic bombs and China's transition to communism, all worked together in 1949 to cause more anxiety amongst Americans. The Republican Party played an important role since the Democrats were seen as too lenient, but were in power, so Republicans had to attack them with accusations of containing communists in order for any changes to be made. Next in the section is the focus on McCarthy and his role in the Red Scare. McCarthy's start into law was poor, as he made false statements to gain Senate positions about war injuries. He wanted to gain some good publicity, so he attempted to be as patriotic as possible, and subsequently called State Department members out for communism, even forging fake images to get Millard Tydings out of office. In 1952 and onward, McCarthy played the role as the congressional head of investigations, which focused on media, entertainment, and universities in its hunt for communism, getting around 1,400 people in total to lose their jobs. He attacked the U.S. Information Agency for holding works of radicals, and through this he pushed for a hold on free speech. He played a role in the 1952 election as well by accusing Adlai Stevenson and other Democrats of communism, assuring Nixon's victory. The importance of McCarthy in the Cold War cannot be understated in affecting domestic policy and causing persecutions of fellow Americans. Finally, Section 6 talks about the effect of the Cold War on American culture. In children's lives, kids in school had to do atomic bomb drills, and kids' comics were filled with characters that were anti-communist. In entertainment, many new films often introduced anti-communist themes, such as The Red Menace, often depicting a dystopian society in which the communists won. With the relations to religion, preachers starting with Billy Graham spoke out against communist ideas, and as a result of the Catholic Knights of Columbus, the Pledge of Allegiance was changed to include "Under God." Education also became based more around STEM fields in hopes of raising scientists who would be beneficial for defeating communists through weaponry and technology. The Korean War had an impact on American life, as well as the massive spending on the war increased inflation and the cost of living, but also benefited oppressed Americans such as African Americans who helped out in the war effort.